Hello, everybody. Today, our guest here is David Bonaccorsi, a real estate attorney here in California, Bay Area. Let's welcome him.
Thank you, Cindy. Yes, my name is David Bonaccorsi. You did a good job pronouncing it. I am an attorney in real estate based in Fremont, Newark. I graduated, though, undergrad and law school from Santa Clara University in the middle of Silicon Valley. And after I began practicing law, I've also been in public service. I was 10 years on the Fremont Planning Commission and 2 years on the Fremont City Council. And as a result, I've been able to balance my real estate practice with understanding housing laws as they impact our communities. And so I'm here and happy and looking forward to answering some of your questions.
I understand you follow state legislation on housing. Can you describe some of the new housing laws that just got into effect?
I'm happy to do so. Thank you, Cindy. There's actually been an explosion of new housing laws this year. And let me set it a little bit in context for people that are new to the community, new to the Bay Area or California. For 50 years, we have not kept up housing with the demand for housing. So particularly in the Silicon Valley, when we have huge companies like Google or Facebook or Apple or other companies hiring at historic levels, we have what's called a jobs to housing imbalance. And so that creates a supply and demand strain, and that as a result, we're having very, very high housing prices in the Bay Area for very little inventory. So the California legislature is trying to address it because what also happens is that when you have so many people trying to outbid each other for the very little housing that's available, you crowd out many, many people in the middle class or teachers or firefighters or police officers and people that when you go to a restaurant and enjoy a new restaurant, the people there need a place to live too. And so we have a huge problem with the underhoused or the those that are experiencing homelessness. And just a little bit more by way of background before I answer your question directly. For 4 years, I served on the board of an organization called Abode Services. And it's a great Fremont story. They started locally and their mission is to end homelessness. And they've grown into Santa Clara County, into Napa, into Santa Cruz, up and down the state. They're a leading advocate and housing developer for affordable housing. I served 4 years there as a board vice president. And so I understand that aspect of the market as well. So to answer your question, Cindy, it's a little bit of a roundabout, but I wanted to set some context for you.
Sure, thank you.
The major pieces of legislation were actually in consecutive order that have been signed into law. Senate Bills 8, 9, and 10, and then there's one that's called 290. And there was a signing ceremony on September 27th on Tuesday in Alameda County, because we're really at the epicenter in the Bay Area on housing issues. And the governor is actually signing 31 total pieces of housing legislation into law. The legislature session just ended. But I'm going to just focus on a few since we don't have a 2-hour seminar here. 8, 9, and 10. Let me focus on those three. Senate Bill 8 is really a continuation of a bill that passed several years ago called Senate Bill 330. And to understand the import of this, what it does is it allows developers, if they have a significant percentage of affordable housing, 50% or more affordable housing, they get to go and have their project approved at the counter. That is a dramatic shift because historically, development projects, mixed-use projects, which have to be 2/3 housing, have to go through a rigorous public hearing process for the planning commission or the city council. And because all of the local pressure historically has been on saying no to development, a lot of housing, and in particular a lot of affordable housing, has sat on the drawing table and never gotten approved. Well, Senator Skinner introduced SB 8 to extend the expiration date of SB 330 from 2025 to 2030, had some clarifying language, but makes it abundantly clear that if you do this, then it really has to be approved what's called ministerially without a planning commission or city council review. And the most famous example is actually the one that's in our backyard in Cupertino at Valco, where there's a new project that's been waiting to be approved one way or the other for about 8 or 10 years. And the developer used SB 330 really as a great leverage negotiating tactic. Said, okay, you can approve my project, which does have to have public hearing, which has less affordable housing, has these amenities. Or if you say, no, we're taking out the grading permit, we're just going to go ahead and do whatever we want and you can't stop us. And so that's been a really interesting dynamic. Let me talk about SB 9 and 10. SB 9 creates a real dramatic shift in our state away from single family housing. When you hear that something's zoned single family, you think of a house with a little picket fence, a little grass in the front yard, a little bit of grass in the backyard, and that's it. But what people don't realize is that single family is exclusionary. Well, what does exclusionary means? It means that single family to the exclusion of any other kind of zoning. So you cannot historically in California, if you had something zoned single family and it burned to the ground, you couldn't put an apartment complex there. You can't put a high rise there. You have to put another single family house. So over time, we've begun to bend that a little bit with what are called accessory dwelling units or junior accessory dwelling units that have been allowed, that have been adjacent to the existing home footprint. But SB 9 has been a dramatic breakthrough in that if you're a homeowner for at least 3 years or more, you have the right to subdivide your lot and actually build up to 4 units. But the concept really is you have your house, you split your lot, and you build a duplex on the other lot. It could be for your children, it could be for anybody. The reason there's a 3-year minimum requirement is that they don't want speculators coming in, buying up housing, and then immediately going for the lot split. So it's a compromise. So it doesn't completely revolutionize housing to be just a duplex creating machine. They want homeowners that have some connection to their property, that they're going to do it in a way that honors the community, honors their neighbors, but it provides for additional housing. Then SB 10 is something that may or may not be used, but it's an amazing power that's given to cities. The city councils now have the power to upzone various parcels. Again, people, and I've done presentations in front of realtor groups for years on some of these things, but only because I've been on the planning commission. And if you're an urban planner or involved in government, very few people really appreciate the concept of a general plan and zoning. A general plan for each city is like its constitution. It really sets the rules for what kind of buildings can be where, what kind of uses can be where, and it regulates that. And zoning has to conform to the general plan, and the general plan has to go to the state, has to be approved by the housing and community development. There's a whole formal process. And generally, there's general plans only done once every 25 years. There can be amendments, maybe up to 4 times a year, but it's a real stodgy, very conservative type of document that doesn't really respond quickly to market conditions. What SB 10 does is it breaks through that logjam and allows councils to deviate from their general plan and convert whatever the parcel is to high density residential in urban areas. Well, what's an urban area? I asked a planner. I was thinking, well, in Fremont, maybe it's next to one of our 3 BART stations. Well, no, it's a pretty broad definition. So basically the entire Bay Area, unless you get out to, outlying areas in Solano or perhaps Sonoma County, if you count them in the Bay Area, most of our areas around the peninsula and the Alameda County and into San Francisco are considered urban. So anywhere, if the Cupertino Council was pro-growth, they could go anywhere and theoretically upzone properties in the Cupertino Hills. They would do that and they would be recalled the next week. But I mean, at least in theory, they have that power. Then SB 290 was also introduced by Senator Skinner. She's out of Oakland, really a terrific legislator. She's in her last term of office. SB 290 creates more incentives for what are called density bonuses. So if a developer has the ability to go into a project and maybe build 8 units based on the the underlying zoning, the number of dwelling units per acre, they can get what's called a bonus if they provide affordable housing. This is a bargain between the city and the developer, but the developer has now more ways to get higher density on some projects. More concessions have to be given by the city. The city can't balk at it if a developer wants to build affordable units. So I think the major, and I will not talk about the other 31, 28 bills or 27 bills, but I think the overarching theme is twofold. One, California that doesn't segregate our market rate housing from our below market rate housing. We want to integrate people in the same communities close to one another. And secondly, there was a whole series of bills that were passed that strengthen enforcement. We can go on to discuss what are called RHNA goals, regional housing needs allocations, where cities are assigned by regional agencies to build a number of units within a certain specified 7-year period of time. If they don't meet them, we're in our 6th round of RHNA cycles. That means, for the last 40 years or so, we've had these cycles of how we're supposed to meet commitments. The only thing true about RHNA numbers is that cities ignored them. They would pretend that they were going to comply, but it was kind of a joke because there was no enforcement mechanism. So there's a lot of, this concept in Japanese, the kabuki theater, where everybody knows what their roles are. There's no surprises. Everybody's performing their roles. But at the end of the day, the curtains are never drawn down on the actors, and they get to perform and pretend. That's going to change. So that's kind of the nutshell of some of the breakthrough legislation that we've had this year.
Thank you so much for the long explanation of every single new legislations that are important to investors. So based on these new state legislations, how is it going to affect U.S. real estate market, or specifically California real estate market and the rentals?
Well, I think in the near term, I would love to say, but it depends upon what your purpose is in housing. My philosophy is that housing is a human right, and we really solve a lot of our social ills if people have a roof over their head. I just think that as a society, we need to move in a direction where we're not worried about making the next mortgage payment, or that. Let's step back. The concept of being rent burdened, the definition is that you're not spending more than 30 to 35% of your gross income on rent, or a case of a mortgage. Well, most of the people that we know are spending 50, 60%. That means that there's very little to save, very little to invest in stock market or in other things, or to go on vacation. So there's all of these deleterious effects. But what is important on the housing market also has to be seen as what's important for climate change. Study after study indicates the most efficient way of living is in, when we say the word density, if you're living in a nice single family neighborhood, you're going to be cringing at density. I don't want density. I don't want traffic. I like to use the term rooftops near transit. Okay, I think they go hand in hand. So what's the effect on the housing market? We're going to have more rooftops near transit. What does that mean? That actually has a benefit on our traditional freeways. We have a lot of people that have had to move because of urban sprawl to the Central Valley to be, I live in Fremont, and we were the worst victim. We have cut through traffic because we're between 880 and 680. So people will be cutting through our streets and using the apps to try to get from one place to another. And unfortunately, a lot of Fremont residents not understanding, if they live and work close together, they don't understand these traffic patterns, and they would blame in-house or in-city development on that. So what's going to be the impact? I'm going to try to answer your question, but I wanted to lead up to it. I think in the near term, because the demand is so high, because the job creation is so intense in the Bay Area in particular, and LA as well, that it far exceeds the housing that we have, that there's still going to be upward pressure on housing prices that we've seen. But I think over time, ideally, that pressure is going to be dissipated somewhat to the extent that we have incentives to create truly market rate housing for the missing middle, the people that are not the executives that are not earning mid six-figure incomes, and for those that are earning less than the area median income that qualify for what are called below market rate subsidized housing. So the more that we have people that are actually finding housing that they can afford and that's in the inventory, then you're not going to have all of this upward pressure on the remaining units where people are buying, housing anywhere in the Bay Area for a little postage stamp parcel in Palo Alto for nearly $2 million. It's just ridiculous. We're in a bubble, but the bubble, I don't think it's going to pop because we have so many people that are paying all cash. We're getting a lot of foreign investors. So the market will, over time, begin to stabilize and the upward pressure won't be as great. But it's going to take, I would think, 10 to 20 years to see that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it took us 50 years to get to this point. We're not going to turn the corner in a business cycle, one business cycle. So,
Wow. What made you think it'll take that long, about 10 to 20 years?
because there are still impediments to housing. You still have local councils that are going to try to exercise control. And I'm going to be very candid in my own election. I lost to somebody that promised no development. Now, she can't keep that promise, but voters want to hear that. If you've got a house and that's your major asset, and you don't want to feel like some new development's going to take away your quality of life, and people are concerned about that legitimately. I understand that, but also I think they have a inordinate concern that their one asset in life is going to go down 20 or 30% overnight. Then they're going to vote for the candidate that's going to protect who they perceive is going to protect that interest. But as I just told you, I've given you statewide legislation that overrides local control. SB 330, which is now SB 8, which was continued, SB 9. Those don't require local control. Another feature of SB 9 that I didn't mention, and SB 10 at least, is that these projects are exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. CEQA was enacted about 50 years ago, and the idea then was it was a tool for environmentalists and a tool for policymakers to be informed about what was the environmental impacts of various projects. But it's been weaponized by anti-housing groups to attack any new development and to tie up those developments in court. And at great expense, and it adds to the expense of building housing. So why is it going to take so long? Because some of these tools are still available. You're still going to have recalcitrance among local officials that are going to maybe threaten to be sued and see what happens, rather than risk their political careers as they see it in short-term gain by responding to public pressures of people that are already in the community. If you're running for office, there's an asymmetry of that. I call it's an asymmetrical problem. When you're advocating for more housing, and all I was advocating for was, yes, more affordable housing, but I did approve projects that were required as I saw it by the general plan and by the zoning, and you can't just act arbitrarily. But when you're approving new projects, you're approving projects for people that don't live in your community and they don't vote. So somebody 10 years from now may say, Bonaccorsi, thank you for approving that project, but they weren't in my district in 2018 to be able to vote for me then. So the political pressures of trying to get elected and reelected on a no housing platform, the incentives for that are so high that I don't dispute the inventiveness of local politicians trying to find compliant city managers and city attorneys trying to find ways of weaseling out of their commitments, not only to provide affordable housing, but to deal with the long-term existential threat of the climate crisis that we're facing. And there's some wonderful articles. I call them fake progressives or faux progressives, where they're going to say, I'm for fighting climate change. I want to, we got to rid ourselves of fossil fuels. But then they vote for housing policies which would in sequence over time create what's called urban sprawl. Have you heard the term urban sprawl, Cindy? Do you know what that means?
No.
Okay, so I don't want to assume terms that you don't know, and I'm happy for your audience too, they may not know it. Urban sprawl means that what used to be jobs in the Bay Area, at least in the Bay Area, I'll give you an example geographically, what used to be the situation where teachers and others lived in the community where they taught, or firefighters and police officers lived within 5 minutes of where they work, because incomes can't keep up with housing. And there's not enough housing here, then you go further into Tracy or to Stockton or to Modesto in the Central Valley to find a house you can afford. So suddenly the Bay Area becomes carpeted, and it doesn't end at Livermore, but it spills over into Mountain House and into Tracy and all those areas where there may be $100,000 to $200,000 per house drop in price for the same square footage. So that's urban sprawl. But what does that do? If you're saying I'm an environmentalist, I belong to the Sierra Club, I believe we should preserve open space and preserve our earth, and wean ourselves off fossil fuels. Well, what have you done? You've now put people in cars having to travel, 75 miles each way, 150 miles round trip, and burning more fossil fuel because you haven't taken responsibility for building housing closer to jobs. So the statewide laws are an attempt to counterbalance the pressures at the local level. However, there's two things on the horizon that we should watch. I'm not, maybe some of your listeners are what we would term no growth. I'm trying to give another perspective for you to consider. But two things that may happen. One is you're getting a lot of these council members on the bench locally that are going to be running for statewide office. And so the consensus that we've had on these bills, like Nancy Skinner's bills, were bipartisan. They passed like 30-3 or 30-2 in the Senate. So those are huge super majorities. Not only just Democrats, but Republicans understand the problem too in California. But if you get more legislators that are from councils that were saying no to development, you may lose that consensus, and it may get harder over time to get these housing bills passed that are needed. Because what happens if we don't get them? At some point, Google is going to look at the map and look at the terrain, or Facebook's going to look at the terrain and say, it is too expensive for our employees to work here. It's too much stress. We only can do so much with telecommuting, which actually may be a more institutionalized thing that we've had in the pandemic, where people are working remotely. That may be a revolutionary breakthrough where we redefine how we work, and that may accelerate some of these accelerate some of the reduction in the pressures of need for some new housing. But they may say, we're going to go to Texas, we're going to go to some other state where we can build and have our employees not have to worry about spending half or more of their salaries on housing. Once that happens, I have a friend who's the executive director of Abode, who puts it this way. He says, okay, it's really a zero-sum game. It's housing or jobs. So if you're not for more housing, which jobs do you want to eliminate? Which industries? And so if you're an investor and you believe in you're bullish about the Bay Area, and you have every right to be, we've got some of the greatest talent here. You have Stanford and Berkeley are such great great source universities that flood our businesses locally with brilliant talent, and we've had a very welcoming attitude to immigrants, and most of our high-tech companies are run by immigrants that came to this country that have made good. But if you turn off that spigot and say we're out of here, then that's going to be a real depressive impact on the rest of the community. You're not going to have the sales tax revenue to support our schools, support other public services, and that's going to have its own cascading effect. So the second thing, just before I lose the train of thought, one would be the red flags or concerns down the line for a pro-housing agenda. As I've heard a rumor that there is a petition being circulated. We just had a recall election that was petition driven, please sign to have a recall election. Well, we have what's called an initiative process in California, where people have the right to put any initiative they want on the ballot if they get enough signatures. And one of them I've heard rumors about, and I'm going to have to see if it's really true, is a petition to have an initiative to take away the ability of the state to regulate housing. So that would wipe out SB 8, 9, 10, 330, 290, what all these, the 31 pieces of legislation, it would gut that opportunity. I think that's unconstitutional, speaking as an attorney now, because I think the state has a constitutional right to, it has a police authority, and the police authority includes zoning and regulating land use. But there may be some people that will be galvanized around that, will organize around that, and it creates a movement that creates resistance and impacts our housing market in a negative way.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your expertise, for sure.
Thank you. It's been a great privilege.
Any final thoughts you would love to share with everyone?
Well, I want to, again, thank you for this opportunity. I think that when we've dealt with the issue of housing in California, and now we're dealing with the issue of landlord-tenant relations during the pandemic, one of the lessons I think that we've all learned from the pandemic is that we have to develop some level of patience and equilibrium. We can't have highs and lows, and things are going to be, we live in particularly in Silicon Valley, when everything is sped up for us and we have information at our fingertips. We tend to think that all of our social ills and all of our health issues are going to be resolved in 24 hours at the speed of light. I think that the best approach is more of a philosophical one, is that there are rights and obligations that we're trying to create with our new housing laws from a public policy perspective, and certain rights and obligations as between landlords and tenants narrowly under the moratorium and the post-moratorium. We need to navigate them intelligently, with patience, with the longer view. And in that way, we can be more strategic in how we problem solve. I think it's a good life lessons, but it's certainly an approach that I take as an attorney and as a policymaker, that we need to be strategic in how we advocate, and strategic how we, whether it's advocating before a legislative body or advocating before a court, we need to take a strategic, longer view about how to best solve these issues. It can be found at my website, 3, the number 3, B as in boy, lawfirm.com, LAWFIRM.com. My email address tails off the domain name. It's D as in David, Bonaccorsi at 3blawfirm.com, and would love to be connected. And
you'll find me loser, set me free.